Alright, let's talk about armor and how it will change everything in Star Citizen when it is fully implemented. And I'm not talking about the armor or personnel armor that you go to the store and buy and put on your character, but ship armor. First off, let's go over what we currently have in the game for ship armor. And from what I understand, there's a little bit of resistances to kind of be that's a little bit like armor in the game, but mostly they just use HP pools in the current game to spoof armor by just giving ships with more armor higher HP pools. And this sounds like you could spoof armor fairly effectively by just giving heavily armored ships a ton of HP, and in some cases this can definitely work, but armor adds a lot of options that you normally can't do when you're just spoofing armor with a higher HP pool, and this would give devs a lot more flexibility when it comes to balancing the game. Let's go over some of these options that armor would add to Star Citizen. The biggest one is that you can actually have more anti-capital or big ship guns without doing weird workarounds and without messing up the balance of the game. Currently, they want size 4 weapons and under to be more anti-fighter weapons, and size 5 and up to be more anti-big ship or capital ship or whatever. And they're trying to achieve this by changing the velocity of the shots themselves. For instance, size 4 repeaters have a speed of 1400 meters per second, and a size 5 repeater has a speed of 700 meters per second. So that is half the speed when you step up from a size 4 to a size 5. And the thought process on this is sound because it is much harder to hit stuff when your projectile is going half the speed of the smaller gun. Thus, they can give these weapons more damage, and they won't be much of a threat to smaller ships because they'll have significantly more time to react to the slower shots of the bigger weapons. But a bigger ship will not be able to maneuver nearly as well as a small ship and is also a lot bigger target, so the slower rounds still are able to find their mark on the larger ships, which they want them to be more effective with, so that you can give these larger weapons more damage without making them overpowered against smaller ships. And this seems like a pretty good system to get around the problem, but it's not perfect. For one, there's definitely still limits that you can give, still limits to the damage that you can give these weapons. Because you can't really have light fighters getting vaporized by 1 or 2 shots, and you can definitely see this problem with the Ares Ion. Before it got nerfed, it had a pretty awesome sniping cannon that was very satisfying to use, but would 1 or 2 shot light fighters. And when I took it on in the Gladius recently, it seemed to be well balanced if you're paying attention, because while I'm just a mediocre pilot, I was able to not get hit by any of the shots in my few encounters with them. But if you're like picking up missions or distracted by something else that's having you stand still, or somebody's shooting ships off the pad, that's where it really becomes an issue, because if an Ares Ion gets a drop on you, there's no time to react, and that's where alpha damage really becomes a problem in the game. The other issue with this system is it gives light fighters the ability to take on bigger ships easier than they should be able to, because they are limited to an HP pool, and light fighters are able to stay on target much easier and keep the damage coming with their smaller guns. Like, I am currently able to take out a hammerhead much faster in a Gladius than a Sentinel, just because I'm able to dodge all the hammerhead shots and effectively stay on target much easier with the Gladius than the Sentinel. And as I mentioned before, you are limited to the amount of damage you can increase the larger weapons to counteract this problem, because of the having too much alpha damage against light fighters and just overall messing up the balance. Now, because of this, it kind of indirectly ties fighters' HP pools to larger ship HP pools, because a larger ship, they want them to be able to be taken down with these bigger weapons in a certain amount of time, but then they can't make those weapons powerful enough to do that if they give the ship too large of an HP pool, because then you have the issue of the alpha damage on light fighters. So this kind of indirectly ties fighters' HP to large ship HPs, because they all have to be balanced together. And another issue, and this is a smaller issue and could even be intended by CIG and may stay that way even after armor comes out, and that issue is kind of the velocity of rounds. And a pretty good example of this is on the Sentinel. If you have 4 size 2s and a size 5 slot, but it's much better to run the size 4 gun on the Sentinel if you are using repeaters so that your velocities match up and all your shots are landing in the same spot. So that all your shots land in the same spot. And one way that you can get around this problem is you can use a cannon, because even the smaller cannons have a 700 meter per second velocity, which is the same as the size 5 cannon. So all your shots will line up with cannons if you want to switch to that. And that's kind of why I think some people have a lot better time using cannons on stuff like the Sentinel and in certain situations than they do repeaters. Now, as I said before, the velocity of the repeaters could be intended, and the devs may not change this, but armor changes would definitely give them a lot of flexibility to make it so that like repeaters all have the same velocity, because they could tie the effectiveness of a gun to armor and not to the velocity of a weapon, so you could have repeaters all having the same velocity while not being much better at taking out light fighters than their size 4 counterparts, but still being more useful against larger or more armored ships. Now let's get into how armor changes all of this and causes a lot of these issues to go away, and gives the devs a lot more freedom and flexibility on how to balance things in the game. First off, you are able to drop the HP pool of larger ships and give them a lot more armor. So in this case, the Ares Ion would be able to keep that sick cannon, and the alpha damage could be turned down so it's not 1 or 2 shotting fighters, and the armor penetration on it could be turned way up so it's still a monster at taking down larger ships. This would also allow them to make other large weapons like size 5 and up weapons for taking out larger ships be more effective against larger ships without making them crazy good at small ships. And all this could be done without changing the velocity of the rounds, making larger weapons feel significantly more useful overall without destroying the balance of the game. The reason why this works is because a light armored fighter or something with light armor, Drake, would have significantly less armor than something like a Hammerhead. So bigger guns with higher armor penetration wouldn't be much more effective or get any more damage on a light fighter like a Gladius or something lightly armored like the Cuddy Black than other weapons with lower armor penetration. But something like a Hammerhead that is heavily armored, the armor penetration would be extremely useful, because something like an Ion size 7 would be able to deliver 100% of its damage straight to the HP pool of the Hammerhead, where something like a size 3 weapon would only be doing like these numbers don't actually matter, but it could be like 30 to 40% of its damage to the HP pool of the Hammerhead. Where both the size 3 and the size 7 gun could be doing 100% of its damage to a Cuddy Black, so the extra armor penetration on the size 7 in this case wouldn't be useful at all, and so you would be losing the main advantage of using a bigger weapon if you're using it against a lighter target. And CIG, if they really wanted to, would be able to get into stuff like over penetration of rounds if they wanted to kind of get crazy with armor penetration and stuff like that. Because guns with insane penetration would do less damage to ships that are more lightly armored, because if the round goes straight through the ship, it would not be transferring nearly as much energy as into the ship as if the ship were to take all the energy of the round and it did not pass through. Kind of a real life example of this is if you go to a gun range and you shoot like an empty plastic bottle with a round that has a decent amount of penetration. A lot of the times the bottle will hardly even move, and quite a bit of the time it won't even fall over. Like, you can't even tell that you shot the bottle, just because the bullet itself, energy isn't being transferred in the bottle, it's just passing through real fast, and most of the energy still is in that bullet and ends up in the ground or whatever that bullet hits. But now if you put a bunch of water into like the same size plastic bottle and you shoot it, it almost explodes, because all the energy of that bullet is being transferred into that bottle of water. And if they do over penetration, they could do something with a similar effect in Star Citizen. And with armor introduced into the game, you could also make it significantly harder for small ships to take out bigger ships without affecting the times of the larger ships that are supposed to be more effective, or just the ships in general that are supposed to be more effective at taking down larger capital ships. That's because you could balance stuff independently with the armor instead of it having to be all the same balance with an HP pool and damage a ship is doing. This would also mean things like Drake being lightly armored would actually mean something. Like a light fighter would be much more effective at taking out a Cutty Steel than, let's say, a Valkyrie, because the Valkyrie would have a lot more armor and resistance to the smaller weapons of light fighters. And ships with like a lot of small weapons like the Hawk would be pushed into potentially a different role than the Gladius, where the Gladius would kind of keep its same role of being a light fighter role and fighting other ships, because the size 3 could have decent penetration on them and still be able to do decent damage to ships. The Hawk, with its insane amount of hard points, would be a lot more effective at smaller targets than the Gladius, but heavily armed targets, the Gladius would win out. And also, if you're kind of decapacitating a ship, the Hawk could be potentially much better at that, because you wouldn't have to penetrate the armor to do that. So this could definitely push the Hawk into more of a bounty hunter role, which would be cool, especially when all the systems for disabling ships come online and things like that. And all the stuff that we're talking about could happen with just a very basic implementation of armor, except for maybe the penetration would be going a little bit, the over penetration at least would be going a little bit crazy. And this is without getting into armor with resistances. Like, you'd be able to switch out your armor for your ship for armor that's more effective against lasers or ballistics, missiles, or perhaps even distortion weapons so that you can't get disabled. But I feel like getting into all the crazy resistances and the effects that would have on the game is probably a topic for another video, so I'm just kind of going to move on to closing out this video. But armor not being in the game currently does beg some questions in my mind. If they haven't implemented armor now, and it's going to be such a core pillar of balancing stuff in the future, why are they going so hard on balancing now? And don't get me wrong, I do love all the balance changes that they have put in, and I think they've been doing a great job with them, but CIG is kind of the king of being like, we don't want to do work twice, so we'll wait for server meshing to implement that, or we're going to wait for the UI to be done to implement that, and so on and so forth. So kind of the overall question that this puts in my mind, how far out is armor from being put in the game for ships that they've decided that it's worth doing twice? Also, it seems like this would be an important tech for Squadron 42, so without the game having one of these critical techs, it begs the question, how far away is Squadron 42? Now, but to be totally honest, we don't know much about Squadron 42, so for all we know, all the ships in Squadron 42 could have their armor already implemented and working. They just don't have them done for all the ships in the game, so they don't want to implement them in the verse. And the reason why we're getting these crazy balance changes in the game currently is just because they need it for Squadron 42, and it already has the armor, so they're going to be balancing all that out, and they figured, hey, while we're doing that for Squadron 42, we might as well do the balance changes for the verse as well. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you have any interesting things to talk about armor, any critiques for my video, let me know down in the comments below. Thank you all for watching.